In this installment, I'd like to respond to a little bit of feedback that I got regarding the last installment. And what the feedback was that it was fine up to about halfway through, but then the guy was saying I lost him at that point. I guess that would have been, thinking about it, probably was around the time that I started talking about disidentification and not identifying. So probably the best thing to do is to say a little bit about that, try and make it less obscure. If identification is a word that you don't know or aren't familiar with, then it's just jargon, and that's not helpful. If it is a word that you are familiar with, then that may not be helpful either, because once we have a bit of terminology, we get a bit casual about using it, and we feel that it's something we know about, just like we know about all sorts of other things, such as wardrobes and teapots and income tax, and this whole range of things we know about. We think disidentification's another thing to add to the list, another thing to add to our repertoire of things that we know about, and that's a problem because we don't know about it. And the whole point about disidentification is it's not part of the furniture of our everyday conceptual reality. So even though we can talk about it a lot, and people do because it's a great thing to talk about, but when we talk about it a lot, it just becomes just like another old, slightly smelly armchair in the living room. It just becomes a word really with nothing behind it. So the best way to talk about identification maybe is to say that we have two qualitatively different ways of being in the world. So qualitatively different means they're not of a kind, they're not one being a development or an extreme of another, they're just completely different, like chalk and cheese. So that's a good thing to know. We don't usually know that. I'm pretty sure we don't usually know that. No one that I ever meet talks about that. And you know, it's not something that you can read about either, particularly. So one way, which is we could say is chalk, is where we're in a very our awareness, our attention is very, very constricted, and we have a very concrete sense of ourselves. And it's a painful sense of ourselves because any concrete sense of who we are is painful because we're kind of cornered. We've been turned into a thing. We've been made into a known thing. So one example of that would be if I'm in a really bad sulk. Now, if I'm in a really bad sulk, I'm very aware of myself the whole time. And I'm also aware of myself as being a very constricted knot of awareness. And I'm also aware of myself being constantly obsessed with myself, and all there is my world. In my world is myself, which is a small thing. And so I'm in a small world of me obsessing about myself, which is a very painful situation. Any modality of interacting with the world where I see myself and as being a self who is interacting with the world is painful. The self is always painful. But in case of sulking, it's intense. We get to know about it. The shoe really pinches. We really do get to know about it. But we don't generally learn the lesson from that, which is to see, well, hang on, this very, very constrained sense of self is horrendously painful. Therefore, all the other senses of self, of me being this self who is interacting with the world or other people, must be similarly painful. So, in other words, we don't learn the lesson from it. The other qualitatively different way of being in the world, which is cheese not chalk, is where we're completely unconstrained and our awareness isn't hemmed in at all, and we're not preoccupied with anything in particular. And this state of mind is a rarer one, much rarer one, and it corresponds to when we say that we're really happy or at peace. We automatically assume that the state of being happy or at peace is another way which the ego can be. He has a peaceful ego, a lovely, happy ego, as opposed to a miserable ego or a sulky little ego. But that isn't at all the case. When we feel unconstrained and free and more truly in touch with ourselves, and we feel happy or peaceful, it's because we know we've forgotten about the self. We've left it behind. We've gone for a journey, and this particular piece of baggage we've left behind ourselves. As Wei Wu Wei says somewhere. So it's not happiness or peacefulness, isn't a particular ego state. It's just when there is no ego. We've forgotten to keep on referencing it in everything. We've forgotten to make ourselves the centre of the world, which we know we're not anyway, but we're constantly referencing everything to ourselves to make ourselves be the centre of the world, and that's what constricts us so much. So there's these two states of being in the world, and because we aren't clear that the state of being in the world which is more joyful and peaceful rather than being racked with obsession and suffering and negativity of one sort or another, is the state of being where we're not constructing a self. We haven't got a concrete sense of self. We're not cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world and highlighting ourselves as being different or defining ourselves in a state of opposition to other people or other things. So we've relaxed that thing that we do all the time. So that's the disidentified state. It's the state where we've forgotten to construct ourselves and reference everything to ourselves. And this state, we know there is such a thing as peacefulness and happiness, and pretty much we're always searching for it. So here's the big problem, obviously, is that the identified self is on this tremendous journey to find well-being, mental health, fulfillment, or whatever we might want to call it, because it hasn't copped on. That all of those things don't need to be looked for. We don't have to try and bring them about by special effort. In fact, it's the special effort which means that we're forever cut off from our own well-being, our own ease, our own naturalness. And the reason for that is special efforts or straining or striving always comes from the I concept, the mind-created sense of self. So whenever the mind-created sense of self strains to bring something about, obviously what it's trying to bring about exists in relation to it. And so it's perpetuating its own narrowness wherever it goes. That own narrowness, which is a constant source of pain to it. Which is why search for happiness or peace or meaning in life is so problematic, because we insist on that meaning being in relation to the mind-created sense of self, which automatically negates any meaning at all, because the mind-created sense of self is a construct, and it's not who we are, and it's not a real thing. It automatically makes everything unreal. Our relationships, our way of seeing the world, our dramas, it's all empty when seen from the point of view of the mind-created sense of self. And that emptiness or meaninglessness is the suffering that we're trying to escape from. So then, coming back to games, and I think I was talking a bit about games. A game is, of course, a constricted or narrowed state of being. We've reduced everything down to a few very simple rules, and nothing else figures in the game. So if I'm playing a game, whatever it could be ping pong, or it could be a game of cards, whatever it is, when I'm playing the game, I've been narrowed down. My sense of who I am and what everything is about has been narrowed down so much that the game is equivalent to the world, so that what is good in the game corresponds to something really, really huge. Because winning in the game now, because the game is everything I know, because I've constricted my awareness down to the game, when I win in the game, this is great, this is huge, this is tremendous. So constricting the awareness down brings the possibility of experiencing intense euphoria, huge euphoria, which, as I was saying last time, is the incentive. That's the incentivization. The flip side of the euphoria is that we're now going to be subject to an equally huge despair or frustration or darkness. And so when we get to the situation that we are in mental pain, and the question is, what can I usefully do to help with this mental pain? The one thing that doesn't help is seeing everything in terms of the concrete sense of self, because that's continuing the misery. So I would fixate on escape from the point of view of the concrete sense of self, and that's misery. So to reject the pain and to fight against the pain, that is something that is done from the point of view of the concrete sense of self, so it enhances and exacerbates the concrete sense of self, which exacerbates the suffering, because that's at the root of the suffering. Because if I was playing a game and then I stopped playing the game, any news of the fact that of loss or winning in that game is no longer important to me. Like, if I'm not playing table tennis, then winning or losing at table tennis is irrelevant, because it's only a game. When I'm in the real world, that doesn't matter at all. I could win, I could lose, but if I'm not totally tuned into the game, I have equanimity towards it, because it's pretty meaningless, really. You know, in a broader sense, it's totally meaningless. It's only a game. So in the same way, when I'm in this game of trying to push the pain away or fight against the pain, playing that game narrows my sense of self down, and it makes me take the pain more seriously. The pain is equivalent to losing in the game. I'm playing the game with the concrete self, and the more I play that game, the more I exacerbate the pain that I'm fighting against. So if I do anything at all to try and get myself in a better situation, that is exacerbating the concrete sense of self, which is exacerbating the pain. If I get halfway smart and I say, okay, I'm going to sit with the pain, I'm also doing that from the concrete sense of self. So that's also exacerbating the pain. So then that brings us to this matter of disidentification. So saying yes is identifying with the I concept, saying no is identifying with the I concept. Any choices that I have are choices of the I concept. So we love to think about ourselves having choices within a situation. That's not good, because those choices belong to the I concept. Every choice I take, or just to be aware that I have those choices, or just to be aware that I have the possibility of control, strengthens the I concept. So, strangely or paradoxically, what comes before freedom is having no choice. I'm not wasting my time thinking about illusory choices that the I concept might have. I've got no choices. I'm in a state that Krishnamurti calls choicelessness. So as soon as I'm aware that I have no choice, I have no possibility of exerting control, there is just the pain, and I cannot change it. Even though that sounds like despair, it isn't. It's just stop when I get the cop on or sense to see that I can't change that. That actually at this point, here I am in a position with no choices. And the moment I can be aware of that, instead of hanging on to hope, which is always said to be a good thing, but it isn't, instead of hanging on to hope, I just be aware of this choicelessness. And the awareness of choicelessness is the point of disidentification with the mind-created sense of self. It's the narrow gate that I was talking about a while ago. When we have the broad gate, the wide gate, the wide expanse, then it's as if all these choices, and we feel great, isn't it great? But all these choices, the fact that they're all illusions, we don't know about. But when everything gets narrowed down so there is no choice, all I can do is be where I am. Then that sounds bad, but that's the gate to freedom. Freedom starts with the truth of realizing that I have no options. So the core of negative therapy is that I'm aware that I can't change my situation on purpose. And that's what allows disidentification. Most of us would disconnect, mentally cut off straight away as soon as we hear this thing, oh, but you can't change your state. It seems like such a violation of our freedom. It seems so nihilistic. So we cut off straight away. We'd rather have choices on the basis of an illusion than no choices on the basis of illusion, because illusions don't have any choices anyway. The other key point, which is helpful to understand, I think, is this idea of not doing. So disidentification, or being present, or being mindful, or being in the present moment, or I just said that, but all of these things sound like things we can do. They sound familiar to us, which is creates problems, becomes part of our repertoire. But being present, which is talked about so much in mindfulness courses, is not part of our repertoire. It's not something that I concept can never be. The I concept can never be present. That's not a choice, that's open to it. The mind-created sense of self can never be non-judgmental. It is a judgment. It's an arbitrary judgment that's taken for granted. It is a judgment. All it can do is judge. So the idea that maybe I can add that to my repertoire for dealing with difficult situations, to be non-judgmental, to be fluid, and to be present, those choices don't exist. They aren't part of my repertoire. But all of these things happen when there is no concrete sense of self. So being present is the absence of the mind-created sense of self. And the mind-created sense of self can never do its own absence or produce its own absence by some kind of clever acrobatic skill. So what we're looking at here is not a doing but a non-doing, a not doing. A not doing, this identification is a not doing. And an example of not doing that would be a bit more understandable maybe is to talk about if I have a habit. So maybe after I have my dinner I smoke a cigarette. That's a habit. And maybe I'm trying to give up smoking so that when I finish my dinner or finish whatever I'm eating, I think I mustn't smoke. Oh yeah, I'm not going to smoke. So instead of the habit of smoking, I have the habit of fighting against the smoking. And that's a doing, just as the smoking is a doing. So I'm trying to get out of my situation of being addicted by doing. But whether I do the addiction or do the fighting against the addiction, it's still a doing and I'm not free. That's why it's so easy to give up or try to give up an addiction and become very, very unfree as a result. So the addiction made us unfree, which is why it hurts so much. But our way of life of always saying no to the addiction is just as painful, just as restrictive, just as unfree. So doing isn't the answer there. And not doing would be going back to the idea of having a smoke after eating, the habit, so the habit of having a cigarette, would be to not do it. But it's not that I'm not doing it because I thought, okay, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not doing it. It never occurs to me to not do it, and so I don't do it. It never occurs to me to do it, and so I don't do it. So that's a not doing. It is in no way the result of a deliberate stance. And in exactly the same way, there's no deliberation in disidentifying. We just get to know about the habit of constructing the concrete sense of self, and we get to know about that habit so much that it no longer has any, we no longer see it as having any possibilities in it, and so quite naturally it loses its glamour for us, it loses its attraction, it loses its interest to us, and so we don't do it. So in a way it's like giving up a sin, but it's not because, I can't remember who said it, whether it was Chogyam Trungpa, when we give up a sin, we still believe that the sin is very delicious and wonderful and we'd love to do it, but we know we have to give it up, so we fight against it. So that reifies a concrete sense of self and it makes the sin more attractive. That's a situation for great suffering. And it's not going to get any better, it's not conscious suffering. So the way to give up something is to see that there's absolutely nothing in it, says Chogyam Trungpa, that we want. That the only reason we did want it was because of an illusion, that we thought there was something in it. And that way we're not hanging on to this idea that it's like a forbidden fruit that tastes so delicious. We know it's not delicious, and so quite naturally, or maybe not instantaneously, but over a while, quite naturally, the habit doesn't arise, the habit doesn't come about. And so there is no longer this habit of creating the concrete sense of self to suffer. Okay, thanks for watching.